All right. Yeah, I think we've got a few people still coming in here, but yeah, we'll go ahead and get started. Just wanted to first of all say good morning, good afternoon, or possibly good evening to everyone, and wanted to thank you for joining another one of PQMD's Pillar Talks. This one is titled Rare Diseases, Challenges in Accessing Medicines. And it's a webinar, or this webinar is one in a series of many webinars that PQMD's community of practices offered to address some of the major trends that we see in global health, provide thought leadership, share best practices, and broach some more provocative issues. My name is Rob Keel, and I'm head of the Managed Access Division at Tanner Pharma Group, and I'm also a member of PQMD's Executive Committee, and I really am pleased to welcome you to this webinar on behalf of PQMD. For those of you that aren't familiar with PQMD, PQMD is a global alliance comprised of about 50 nonprofit and corporate members, healthcare companies, all focused on advancing the role of product donations worldwide. PQMD was founded in 1999, and it's been guided by 5 core pillars: humanitarian assistance, health system strengthening, disaster response and preparedness, guidelines, and last but not least, knowledge management. Likewise, if you weren't aware, last year PQMD launched an initiative called the Global Alliance for Rare Disease, or GARD Access, focused on developing a set of guidelines and a framework for improving access to treatment in treatment of rare disease, or for rare disease patients in low and middle income countries. So during today's webinar, Harpreet and others are going to share more about GARD Access and how PQMD and its members are supporting the rare disease community and the access challenges that they face. So pretty excited about this webinar, the conversation getting started around the movement within the rare disease space to accelerate patient access to quality medicines, treatments, and services for rare diseases by leveraging the expertise within PQMD and elsewhere. So before I do that, just wanted to cover off a few basic housekeeping items for all the webinars. We ask that you put your name and organization that you represent in the chat box. If you can, please remain on mute, especially if you're taking care of personal matters. And the chat box is open for questions and comments. We will be recording this session and posting it out on PQMD's community of practice later this week. And last but not least, Victoria will be posting the link for our community of practice out in the chat box. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to Harpreet Ram. Harpreet is the founder and president of EVR Consulting. She has 20 years of experience helping both large and small companies optimize their medical affairs operations. And in the past 10 years, she's been focused specifically on improving access to medicines for rare disease patients, and really has been instrumental in designing, developing, and implementing several global medicine access programs to provide life-saving therapies to patients in 5 continents. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Harpreet, and you can take it away.
Thank you, Rob. I appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for joining this webinar. We're super excited to talk about GARD Access. So the reason why we started GARD Access last year in collaboration with PQMD was to trying to address an unmet need that exists for the rare disease patients, particularly in the lower to middle income countries. So we wanted to try to provide or bridge the gap that the patients in these countries face due to a number of different types of issues. Some of them are related to the high cost of medicine. Some of them are related to the lack of infrastructure in that country to be able to handle these very specialized medicines. There's also often there's no reimbursement for these types of medicines because of the high costs. We also run into challenges when it comes to physician awareness related to certain rare diseases or their education. I've come across countries where there's not even a single physician to treat some of the rare diseases. Additionally, there are enormous costs around the logistical challenges of getting these highly specialized medicines into their countries. And often they can require cold chain and pose challenges when it comes to storing these medicines in a fridge where sometimes the electricity doesn't exist. And so we wanted to try to pull a project together that tried to address this unmet need. Historically, we've seen that the industry has tried to address this problem by launching their own individualized humanitarian efforts. But what we've found is that they're only able to accommodate a very small fraction of the unmet need that is in these countries. And what they're able to offer doesn't go very far. And often these companies are realizing that these efforts can also be unsustainable because in many cases, these medicines for rare diseases are chronic therapies. So making a commitment to treat a patient free of cost for a lifetime becomes cost prohibitive for these companies. So hopefully this project tries to address how do we make these access to medicines more sustainable, and also not purely based on charity, because that's not going to address the whole need that currently exists in these markets. The other area that we wanted to try to address through GARD Access was the implementation of guidelines. If you're trying to implement a rare disease program, access program, or humanitarian program, and you try to actually go find any guidelines that govern these types of programs or provide any guidance to either the industry or the patient advocacy organizations or any other stakeholders that's involved, you'll quickly learn that there's nothing that currently really tells us what you can or cannot do or should or shouldn't do. So part of this project was the objective to develop a set of guidelines that can help all of the different stakeholders involved in the rare diseases to be able to run their programs that are ethically and morally are on the right path. So I'm joined today with Sarah and Durhan, my colleagues that I've been working with for the past several months or years now. Sarah is head of rare disease commercial and asset strategy and chief of staff at UCB. And Durhan is the president and CEO of Canadian Organization for Rare Diseases. And we're going to walk through some of the questions and learn from both Durhan and Sarah what the challenges are so far, and then lead into our GARD Access project. So Durhan and Sarah, collectively, you both have been working in the rare disease space for decades. Can you tell us a little bit about what brought you here and the work that you're currently doing? Durhan, if you can go first.
Sure, I'd be real happy to. And first of all, thank you so much for the work that certainly PQMD has started, that GARD Access represents, and you personally, Harpreet, for I think all of the work that you've been putting to it. Also, thank you very much for it from the very beginning, including the patients in it. And I think that is key to what it is that hopefully will be, to making this a huge success. I just full disclosure, I'm a mother. I have two children who were born with rare conditions. So I've been involved with rare conditions, I guess, since my children, but really professionally as well. I'm a psychologist, but I've been working with the rare diseases community, certainly in Canada, for a good number of years, and also over the last 5 or 6 years as chair of Rare Diseases International, which is our global alliance of patient organizations, and probably much more the point of intersection with the work of GARD Access. So really happy to be here. I mean, and as you can imagine, when you go around the world and participate with patient organizations there, and I want to do a shout out to some of the patient representatives that are here. What we do know is obviously, access to medicines is not the only thing. As you talked about, some of the very basic access is not there. Basic access to diagnosis, basic access to care, the ability to actually be able to intervene even with diseases that really don't require high level medications, but could be managed with some other kinds of changes in diet, changes in terms of actual early intervention, in terms of rehab, et cetera. It doesn't necessarily exist. But medicines are essential in the sense that in many cases, we've seen around the world, when you bring in a drug into an environment, that you actually spring forth a whole bunch of things. I mean, I'm looking at remembering the early work with them. I don't know if we talk about products here. I won't talk about specific products, but some of the LSDs, the lysosomal storage diseases, setting up clinics that also brought in diagnosis, that brought in setting up clinics of care, that brought in family groups. It brought in training of clinicians so that they could actually properly not only diagnose, but care and monitor. These are the kinds of things that are really essential. I mean, much more recently, as we've seen around the world, what's happened with some of the most advanced therapies coming in, spinal muscular atrophy, and how that has absolutely been able to create pockets. And I won't say worldwide explosion of access to care, but pockets, right? So how do we do it? And so one of the things I find really exciting about this is the opportunity to think about how do we address those unmet needs. I saw a presentation once, and I may, be making it up in terms of what I remember, because I'm trying to find a document to it, is, we talk about how many patients are actually treated by drugs for rare diseases, and it's something around, 50 million or so. But what I really see at all was the more astonishing statistic, and that is even in the most developed countries, only about 10% of patients who would be eligible to receive a specific rare disease drug actually gets access. And globally, less than 1% of patients who could benefit from a rare disease drug actually gets access to that. I mean, when you think about it, that's heartbreaking, especially when you think about the kind of research and development that's gone into these. But even beyond that, when we know that by investing in these therapies, we actually now begin to open up for diagnosis. What happens when we open up for diagnosis is, remember, one of our partner groups in Ghana, he was able to make a case for diagnosis by actually demonstrating that about 80% of patients coming into their center for emergency care were people with undiagnosed rare diseases. And by diagnosing a rare disease, he just actually cut that off in the sense that you can now give a patient a diagnosis, a family. You may not be able to provide a cure for them or a treatment, but at least you don't have them coming in, and you don't do the worst thing, and that is they get mistreated. They get prescribed something. So I think all of this focus in terms of therapies is hugely important, not the least of which it brings in the pharma partners. I mean, most of these innovations that we're looking at across the globe, where we've been able to have advanced clinics, where we're able to do the training, where we're able to bring in patients with support groups, comes in because companies make a commitment. Not only to say, I'm going to give you a drug, because nobody believes you can just dump a drug into a country, but they make the commitment. How do we work with the health systems there? How do we work with the clinics there? How do we work with the patient groups, oftentimes as well, to actually create in that community? And sometimes it's the patients and it's the clinicians who brought them in. Sometimes it is, in fact, some other reason. So I think the idea that we could do this systematically, Harpreet and Sarah, I think is just really exciting. I can tell you the first time I saw this, I kind of looked up and thought, oh my God, is this like, it's an answer to our prayers. I mean, we've been, and I look at my colleague, Mary Wong, who's on this, and she's with Rare Disease International, head of our global access working group there. This is what we're working for. We're working to translate what we understand in terms of the barriers and the challenges into action, into projects that are going to allow us to do this. I also really love the idea that it's going to be done on a project basis. I mean, obviously we cannot, solve all the problems. What I'd love to see is we invest in successful pilots and projects, right? I'm not sure if I'm supposed to answer all this now. I've forgotten. I apologize now to both Victoria and Harpreet and Sarah if I'm just going on and on, whether there was meant to be a more series of discussions that get to this point. But I'm just, as you can see, I'm just so excited by what this represents. That I do want to say is that we want to be able to help. The last thing, two things I will say is what I think is exciting about this, this approach and the framework, which I think Harpreet will present to some degree, and hopefully Sarah, talks to in terms of where pharma comes in on this, is that we believe it's being done, as we say, in a respectful manner, that it's being brought in on a project basis. And it's not being brought in, as you say, as a humanitarian effort. It's not being brought in as a donation, because that's not sustainable. Coming in as a sustainable investment into that rare disease community. And it may be small and it may be larger, but we want to make sure that we're starting off thinking, can it be sustainable? There's nothing worse, as you say, these are lifetime treatments. You cannot come in and say, I'll set up a pilot project, I'll give you treatment for 2 years, and good luck. And we have seen those happen. Not because people deliberately intended to do that, but because that was the way it was done, right? It was a donation, and then when James shifts, the donation disappears. This is not sustainable. And I think we love the idea would come in. I also love the idea it's going to be done as a co-production with the community. So what works, and also what can community contribute? We're the doctors, we're the patient groups, where's the community support? What's the government going to contribute to this? We need to make sure we understand there is a responsibility on all sides to make sure it's going to be sustainable, because we want these to be successful. I think the other thing that's really important for me and what we're talking about here is that we can demonstrate back to everybody there's a return on the investment. This is not just a contribution. This is not a handout. This is an investment in a series of services. It's an investment in the community, and we need to be able to demonstrate, as Samuel did, what's the economic payoff in terms of doing this investment? Because unless we can do that, we cannot expect that these are going to be sustainable. And we all know there's a huge economic payoff to it, not just in terms of avoiding expenses that are unnecessary or avoiding treatments that are not only not useful, but actually harmful. But there's a genuine investment in terms of having more clinicians, having more clinics, having those surrounding, workers, right, that are actually going to contribute back. So I think we need to also be thinking about this as a very positive kind of way of being able to actually lift. We were laughing the other day about the investment in a sports facility, and we talk about the huge spin-offs in terms of jobs and communities and people coming into it. We're talking about the same thing here, but we oftentimes don't think of it that way, and we don't present it that way. There's a huge economic, return on this. So I'll stop there and really want to, as I said, I'm not sure how much I was supposed to do there, but thank you very much for the opportunity to kind of put this forth.
Thank you, Darhan. I'll come back to some of the points you were making, but Sarah, if you can elaborate from the industry side, some of what you've witnessed in your journey of multiple decades now.
But not quite as long as Darhan, but certainly, my work in rare was started in a disease that I knew absolutely nothing about in the metabolic space. Similarly, lysosomal storage disorders, a condition that affects primarily young boys. And if I look at what I learned in serving the mucopolysaccharidosis type 2 community, one thing stands out, and I think, Darhan, you've alluded to that, and it's that sense of community. These conditions, diseases, syndromes, they don't know borders. If you look at trial participants in the rare disease space, there may be an N of 12 or as high as an N of 97, depending on the population, but people are coming from all over the globe seeking support in managing their condition. And I think from an industry side of things, some things stay the same, and there's still great inconsistency in the way that we think about how we can help advance the science, be it through understanding and better characterization of the epidemiology of the disease, to further, serving outside of pure drug treatments alone, the needs of the individuals or families. And I think if I think back over my time served, one consistent piece that comes to the front of my mind is we're stronger together. And that's kind of an old adage, but we saw challenges in serving individual patients affected with MPS type 2 from the United States and the state of Oregon, and refusing to provide support for not just treatment, but the holistic care of the individual that was diagnosed with the disease, to individuals in Brazil. So again, trying to figure out how do you serve these communities when some of them, and in my experience in working in rare, I've worked in communities as small as known of less than 300 individuals affected around the world to greater than 50,000. The dynamics remain the same in that sense of community, of really thinking about how we go beyond just industry and investing in science. And science can be defined in many ways, to what Duran was saying around diagnosis, but all the way through and understanding the lived experience. And that's where, partnering and conversing and having open dialogue with the patient organizations from an industry side of things is so critical to really understand the lived experience. We have a lot of tools to measure sometimes, and sometimes we have no tools. So to really understand what matters with that lived experience with someone that's affected, or their care team that are affected by those with a rare disease, it's asking the questions and being open to listen and understand how to contextualize that journey to further illustrate the unmet need. Because we're all on this educational journey, whether I'm sitting in industry or Duran in patient advocacy, Harpreet, and how you're serving across multiple groups. But if I think about my time of service, I also think about the education, the awareness that we were able to impact from ministries of health in countries that had maybe 2 individuals affected with MPS type 2 that were immediately on the phone to say, how can we work together? And it's being open to that, and that every individual patient matters for every reason that all of us could collectively bring together. So for me, if I think over the decades of time of service, and also the first time ever working to figure out, how do we provide access to these medicines that are yet to be licensed, yet to have the first major health authority approval, individuals that may not have been able to qualify for our clinical studies. How do we find the right balance to do the correct thing from an ethical standpoint, from a risk benefit standpoint, all of the things we have to weigh in. So long story short, none of us can solve it alone. I think we have to stay open and vulnerable and willing to find alternatives. At the same time, we have to find ways to do it in a sustainable fashion. And I think that's where starting the dialogue early, often, and with really meaningful kind of stopping points along the way, I think we can get there together. And that's part of the reason, meeting the families, be it in the favelas in Brazil, when I had the pleasure of being there, and humbled by what they were, doing to raise awareness and education for their child, to individuals in my home country, the United States, or even working in Switzerland, where there are so many different health ecosystems and dynamics of, you might have a multitude of specialists, or you may have to travel by bus 17 hours to get to one. So I think we can impact different pieces of this along the journey. And for me, it's those low middle income communities, because they can even reside in this beautiful country of the United States, or even Switzerland, where, there are different health systems in place that can or haven't quite figured out how they can support individuals and their care team that may be affected by rare disease. So that's kind of, I think back over 10 years, Harpreet, that's why I'm still in the rare space and why I'm so passionate about it. So back over to you, I guess. I could talk for a long time, so you have to cut me off. Sorry.
Thank you. I could do the same. I could talk for hours if nobody stops me. You've both alluded to this, and this was also one of my biggest learnings as I went on the ground in some of the countries where we were trying to help some of these rare disease patients. And it was that access to the actual medicine is only a part of the problem. It's not the problem, that there is a number of other issues that these patients face in just trying to even get to a clinic, bus fare, and this and that. So Darhan, could I ask you to sort of elaborate a little bit more and focusing more, zeroing in on more on the patient in terms of what their day-to-day life looks like and when they're suffering from a rare disease?
Well, I mean, obviously, as you allude to, there is a huge range of environments, a huge range of rare diseases. I will say that when we're talking about, and I love the fact that Sarah, we're talking about low and middle income communities, because it isn't just countries. And certainly even in the best resource countries, we have huge numbers of people, pockets of them sometimes, but also individuals who are left out. Certainly in Canada, in the US, and in other countries where there are immigrant populations, these patients aren't getting there. They don't have the language, they don't have the connections, they may not even have a health card. So we know that there are really people that are suffering. There are also, as we say, cultural barriers. We're speaking about it from a global perspective, right? Stigma around a rare disease is huge in so many environments. Not even if the disease doesn't even have to be physically disfiguring in a way for patients to actually experience stigma. We talk about the fact that many of these 80% are genetic diseases. And Sarah, we're talking about the metabolic diseases, they're all inherited diseases. And the challenge around getting people to come in and even being diagnosed when they've got a family member, we've got to help patients and families understand, kind of what that means in terms of being able to identify without putting people into a category that stigmatizes them. So I think it's what we're trying to talk about is we have to work within the culture. We have to work within the ethics of those communities. And the only way we can do that is partner with that community itself. Partner with the clinicians, partner with the patient organizations, partner with the other kinds of social supports. One of the best examples I remember in MPS is a clinic in Seoul, Korea. And the company went in, invested in the clinic, trained the physicians up. They have developed the most amazing network. And what that clinician was doing was also training physicians from other countries. I remember when I was there visiting, they had a whole host of young physicians there from China being trained in terms of management of NPS. And part of what the company did do was to make some of the therapies available, but really the community took off. The patient groups that we met there were absolutely amazing in terms of their participation. They're setting up social groups, the families as well. So I think the challenge in many cases, as you say, is that, patients in many respects have many challenges. We sometimes ask the patients, is it worse to not have a treatment for the disease, or is it worse to know that there's a treatment and you can't get it? One of the loveliest families we know, and part of our RDI family, is a family in Malaysia, has a young son with SMA. When the child was first diagnosed, there was no treatments. The family was amazing. They set up a support group. They did everything they could in terms of care, treatment, in terms of being able to engage the whole health, their genetic clinic to work with them. Then we get a treatment. Of course, they're not going to get access to it. They continue to work, they continue to support, they continue to grow the community, and they finally did get access to it. I think by this time, the child must have been 12 years old. And as you can imagine, with a progressive neuromuscular disease, by this time, he had become significantly, more disabled. And they're working not only just to get access, and they got the access through a sort of a clinical trial, compassionate access combined program. We thought it was really clever in terms of how the company put it together. And he'd been working so hard. I mean, what is his comment? His comment is, number one, I got to work to get other families to get access. I mean, that's what's his huge thing. The second thing is not like, oh my gosh, why did it take so long? What he said, which blew my mind, was what we now have is predictability of the future of this child. We know he's going to be stabilized. We know what the next 10 years with this child is going to be like, whereas before we had no idea, no hope for a future. I mean, this is what we're talking about in terms of how transformative some of these programs are. But again, it's working within the community, it's working with them to kind of create the environment around it so that they can actually support this. So yeah, I mean, unfortunately, patients are patients everywhere. That same story, right, is repeated everywhere. And it can be in a very wealthy country. And I look at many of these communities who are living in some of the very best resource communities, knowing they're not getting access when other people are. That's as heartbreaking as, having whole countries, right? They can't do it. So yeah, I mean, the opportunities that this brings is how I look at it. Not so much where's the heartbreak, but where's the opportunities and how do we actually help make it sort of, I think, as this family with this 14-year-old boy now says, we now have a future.
Yeah, and I think I can relate to a similar example as well, Darhan. I think this is one of the times when my heart broke in a million pieces was a father telling me that for 6 years, he used to pull up a bottle of the treatment that his son needed. And every night he showed it to his son and said, someday I'm going to get it. And what you saw then is that him helping start a patient advocacy organization in India and then helping to bring those medicines into the country. So it's a huge challenge. And I also wonder and struggle with the same thing. Is it better to know or not to know? Because we've seen the reverse as well, where in Pakistan, we witnessed a huge surge of patients getting diagnosed, but no treatment because the Ministry of Health just didn't want to take on the burden of, financially to treat these patients. I don't know what the right answer is either. I try to wonder sometimes myself. But so
However, Harpreet, I have hope. I have a little bit of hope, and a glimmer of hope came true, at least for me, in looking at two major occasions over the last 18 months. One was the UN resolution for access for those affected by rare disease. The other piece that was an amazing moment was finally moving to newborn screening for the MPS disorders in the United States. And I thought I would never see the day. So I think it shows that there, we can start to see progress, but we each have a role we can play. And I think that on an industry side of things, despite working in a highly regulated environment, there is possibility and there's a way to come together again, collectively, but thinking about to the points that have been raised. I think from a sustainable standpoint, we can't do everything. We can't do every single country, but we can look at every single individual patient and think about what could be possible and ensure we're building the means to provide that continuity of care once treatment is available, and managing to help further understand the needs and fill them over the course of time, and educating others within those borders of specific countries to help facilitate the ongoing management needs. So I do have a couple of hopeful points I just have to drop in there, because we have seen progress, but it takes all of us, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I wholeheartedly believe that this is one of those things or challenges where we all have to just come together collectively. Going back to you, Sarah, can you highlight some of the efforts, and I think you and I have been involved in a couple of them, in terms of what the industry is trying to do and where it's not really able to make the difference that I think we were hoping to.
Sure, I'll try to be succinct. I think on a couple of points, most industry organizations now are thinking about early on how to facilitate access to medicines in these rare conditions prior to having an official first license. There are pathways available, so it gives a sense of comfort from a patient safety, from a regulatory, from a legal perspective, that you can provide access to medicines for those with the greatest unmet need without compromising clinical trials, without putting patients at risk. There are certain rules you have to play by, but the movement has been, wow, it can be possible. How do we do this? I think what industry remains and struggles with is, how do you then transition out? If you think about longer term, with some of the good case examples from the likes of Genzyme, now Sanofi, Shire Human Genetic Therapies, now Takeda, who have helped facilitate access to medicines in markets that wouldn't be classic markets that you would have an operating model or a business presence in normally, of the likes of, it could be Brazil, it could be China, it could be India, it could be other parts of the southern cone of Latin America. I think that the question should be, how can we, what could be, and A, do we need to go it alone? B, how do we partner with the other actors or members that are present there, be it ministries of health, academics that may be hosting centers of excellence and have lessons they can learn. If we think about the beauty of the European referral networks in Europe that are collectively helping have better continuity of care for those with rare diseases, how can we transfer some of those good practices and put it into something meaningful that could be applied? Those are questions. I think another area where industry has made progress in helping facilitate dialogue is with our health authorities, be it the FDA or the EMA. I think the question remains, what else can be possible to facilitate, the appropriate diagnosis and then downstream access to treatments and the ongoing care? Because we all have a spirit of advancing the science and helping, and we'll bring it always back to the individual patient or patient's family, that care team that we also can't forget about in the sense of community. So I think, moving from it's an absolute, and the other piece I think that's become very evident, and we see it now also moving with relationship to data privacy, and how we can communicate to a patient's level in different markets, is also finding ways to remove the barriers that we've created ourselves sometimes in industry on that disparate data, and not maybe thinking at the very start of your clinical trial design on DE&I, and how do you start to look beyond that quick and the rapid, but that more complete, and it may be part of your greater plan. So I think it's really that the theme that you might be hearing is that connecting of the dots and asking different questions and doing it in that true sense of being vulnerable, that not one of us as a person present around the table has all of the answers, but collectively we can come with some ideas and solutions. And there are some good case studies that we can learn from of what not to do, but also really good things that can be done. And I do think we have, for me, that the UN resolution and efforts like this that give me hope that in another year time, 18 months time, we'll start to see some additional movement and support for the rare communities around the world.
Yes, absolutely. I hope I have the same hope. Darhan, you've been involved in a lot of different types of access initiatives, trying to accomplish various things in trying to help the rare disease patient community. Can you talk a little bit more about some of the projects that you've been involved in?
Yeah, I mean, some work and some don't, right? And I think what's lovely about this is that hopefully we're setting this up as deliberate learning projects. We're not going to necessarily hit everyone out of the park to begin with. We definitely are going to have some criteria, because I think if we do this right, the demand will be huge and certainly much greater, not just in terms of what companies can donate. You guys can probably donate a whole bunch of stuff, but it will be limited by, what is the capacity for setting up really successful projects. And I think that's the case. So I think, need to have some good criteria. I mean, some of the things you've already alluded to, we've had the situations where, can I say it, in Pakistan, where we had a great project go in, and it was an agreement that we would do this as a 2-year experience, and that after that 2 years, the government would pick up in terms of the funding of it. And by the time we got to the end of the 2 years, the government says, thank you, but no thank you. And I think that's a huge, huge problem where, the commitment doesn't, and then for lots of reasons, the money isn't there, the changing government isn't there, there was never goodwill to begin with, and it's not just that one country. I think we have to acknowledge that in many cases, there are many others. I mean, the sad thing we hear is that in many cases, there are so many people that have their hands on that drug chain that, only a small percentage of the therapies that are quote, donated actually get to the patients. And that's something we really have to stand up and acknowledge. We can't back away from that there is, in fact, real challenges all around that drug supply chain. And again, setting up deliberate projects that can acknowledge openly kind of where those barriers might be. And we need to get all those players in place to say, okay, we agree, we're going to make this work, because what we want is good, successful experiences. We want to be able to demonstrate, right? I mean, we've also had lots of cases, as you know, where there's been great individual, as I think about this clinic in one of my favorites is really, the clinic that you've got in South Korea. But we also, I was in Colombia where, an individual patient was able to get access to a drug treatment by doing what it is that, unfortunately, what you do in Colombia and what you do in Brazil, if you want access to an approved treatment, you sue the government. So what she was able to do was sue the government. But guess what? What she did beyond that was to actually set up a parent network then, where she trained everybody on how to sue the government. And, that's amazing to me. I think after the 5th successful lawsuit, the government kind of threw up their hands and say, okay, we give up. Let's just kind of provide this therapy. That's where, which is a sad way of looking at it. But, that's the kind of thing that you look at in terms of saying, that's what we're doing. We're doing it somewhat out of desperation. So they have a very deliberate approach, to have an approach that's actually built on sustainability and identifying all those barriers. It goes back to that whole thing, really engaging the community, though, to be a part of it, to help create it, that co-creation part of it. It's that old thing, you give a man a fish, right? And you feed him for a day. We actually train people how to fish, and we build a community of fishers, and we can actually sustain the community. That's what I feel like we're doing. We're building community of fishers, and we're going in there, with the eyes wide open in terms of what the challenges are. But we really are going to be able to, kind of engage, hopefully, in terms of developing those. So yeah, I think we take all the experiences that haven't worked. I can't even remember some of the very early HIV days. I remember standing outside of a clinic, and I said, "What is those 2 trees for?" And somebody says, well, that's a man's street and that's a women's street. I says, what do you mean? Well, men and women aren't allowed to commingle. So people come in, they get tested for HIV. They're waiting to get their results. They have to hang around here because they traveled many distances. So the men live under that tree and the women live under that tree. You kind of go like, wow. And the big innovation is let's just build them shelters. They still built them separate shelters because that's what the community wanted. But at least we understood, right? You know, what is it we need to do? So respecting where the tradition is, respecting what people need, working with them to put in the solutions, right? Without trying to overrun kind of what that environment is about. So sometimes it's the little things that actually make the big difference.
Yeah, absolutely agree with that. So with that, maybe I can ask my colleagues at PQMD to pull up the slides on GARD access and what that project is trying to do. And I can give you a little bit of background. So GARD, again, stands for Global Alliance for Rare Diseases. And if we can progress to the next slide, please. I have this quote because I do feel quite strongly that every life is worth saving. I've been told many times by a lot of different people, why should they help one patient when they can help 50, 100, or 1,000? And my response is try telling that to their parents, because to that parent, that's still their child and their equivalent of anyone else's child that would matter to their family as well. If you could progress to the next slide, please. This slide makes me smile and laugh every single time because I think I have a couple of my old colleagues on this call, and this slide was actually developed back in 2014. I do believe timing is everything, and I, excuse me, I think that the time is right now to, sorry, still recovering from my cough. I think the time has now come to trying to bring this forward and trying to get everybody to play their part. So our idea for GARD access was based on what I call the social model, and it's really an idea that was pioneered by a man named, who was also a Nobel Prize winner from Bangladesh. His name is Muhammad Yunus, and he essentially pioneered the idea of social business model, and kind of going back to what Durhan said earlier in terms of sustainable investment into projects, because charity is not the solution, or at least not the long-term and a sustainable solution for, particularly for this challenge when it comes to rare disease access. So there are a number of different stakeholders. You've heard both Durhan and Sarah talk about the variety of entities that must play their part in and contribute towards a solution. So the social model idea is essentially everybody contributes what they're good at contributing into a centralized pool, and that then gets invested into where the need is, and the patients can finally get access. So you see manufacturers, you see patient advocacy organizations, which those two entities are often at the forefront, but what I usually don't see playing an active part in access is governments. There is a hesitation to approach the ministries of health to partner on these initiatives because they feel that the industry feels like they're building expectations, or sometimes the ministry doesn't actually want to meet with you. So we need to actually push for them to play their part and contribute towards a solution. They may not be, they're able to buy every single medicine, but they need to contribute at least what they can. And then, of course, there are other sources of public and private funding that can go towards it. By service providers, I mean entities that can help launching some of these programs. They can be medical education providers, they can be logistics partners that can help move these specialized medicine from one end to the other. So there are a lot of different players that have a responsibility in making this approach sustainable. If you could go to the next slide, please. So the proposal is to create an alliance of all of these variety of stakeholders, which is what you see at the top. Is the alliance comes together. It would include industry, it would include patient advocacy organizations, it would include ministries of health and physicians and experts who are desperately needed, especially in the low to middle income countries where training is an enormous gap. Within the Alliance, then there is the GARD Access Secretariat. These are the employees of the Alliance who are then responsible for designing and implementing the variety of projects. As Darhan mentioned earlier, we're not trying to boil the ocean. We're trying to do one thing at a time, or one project at a time, trying to learn and refine before we go broader. There are, roughly around 4 million rare disease patients. So obviously we cannot start to treat all of those patients. So the idea is that the Secretariat will partner with various Alliance members from the industry and all of the other stakeholders, including patient advocacy, to come up with a project to bridge a need in a particular country or for a particular disease. And then the approach would be based on 4 different types of pillars, which I'll go into the next slide. But the idea is that the Alliance has the one of the pillars is the capacity and reputation building. There are partners that can help implement and bring about change. There is education and awareness and patient advocacy, and last but not least is the technology platform. One thing that we hear over and over is when it comes to rare disease patients, Sarah mentioned this earlier, sometimes the trials are as small as 12 patients. And so we need to learn and track that information to the best of our ability so we can use that information to then further enhance how the trials are being implemented, or even some of the medications, how they're being administered to different types of patient populations. And on the bottom, what you see is the foundation of it all are the GARD access guidelines. My colleague Patty is on the call as well today, and she led this initiative to develop the first set of the guidelines that we're putting forward. If you could go to the next slide, please. So I mentioned earlier that there are various pillars, and one of the things that hopefully you heard from both Darhan and Sarah is that not every single country has the same problem. They're all on different wavelengths, and even within the country, there could be pockets of communities that are worse off than the other areas of a same country. So the goal of GARD access would be to customize the approach based on the country needs. I've done a lot of work with Indian patients. What I do know about India is that really the only thing they're missing is reimbursement. They have a phenomenal set of physicians that treat rare diseases. They're very well educated. Patient advocacy is brilliant in the country. There are a number of different organizations that are fighting for the rights of the rare disease patients. But what you don't see is the actual access to the medicine. You'll find hundreds of patients that are just waiting for help. Whereas you go next door to Pakistan, where I came across the fact that there wasn't even a single lab that could actually diagnose a patient. So we had to get creative and have those lab samples shipped to Germany to actually confirm a patient diagnosis. So the approach for every single country will have to vary. And that's what GARD Access is proposing, is that we plan ahead of time, collaborate with all of the different stakeholders that you see here in the green box, particularly the ministries of health. I feel quite strongly about this because I've seen things not work out in the past because the Ministry of Health wasn't at the table to help you think through and actually also partner with you to come up with a solution that would work for that country. And the little chevrons that you see around the picture with the numbers, those are our guidelines that we've drafted. We're almost near finalization of both how we think the framework will work as well as the guidelines, and we're expecting to deliver the finals towards the end of this month. And that was the phase 1 of GARD Access project. We're now looking at what phase 2 could potentially look like, and that includes building the actual alliance and inviting members who could play a key role in, as well as trying to actually roll out a proof of concept project, either with 1 or 2 countries and 1 or 2 disease states, to show that this could potentially work before we actually really start to roll this out to the wider patient community. So I'll stop there because I know I'm at time and I'm trying to stick to my time. We can now open the floor for questions. And Victoria, if you don't mind, reading through some of the questions that might have come through. And if you haven't asked, please do let us know what we can help you with.
Sure. Thanks, Harpreet. This question is from Bill Lynn. It's directed to Sarah. GARD Access mission is tied to access to medicines, which by default makes the pharma industry central to the initiative. What advice do you have regarding how GARD Access should engage with the pharma sector, and what value proposition the sector expects from that engagement?
That could be a whole nother talk. I think there are a few things that come to mind, and it's a really rich question because we talked about the journey of a patient, and so it's a diagnosis through treatment, through that continuity of care. And so with that underpinning all of that is, I think, what industry to have GARD Access engage with industry to make sure this is centralized is having the dialogue to understand that particular manufacturer's interest, questions, what their understanding is of the unmet need of the disease, and some of the areas that may be underserved, and start to map that out, because what industry can do and would expect is to be able to facilitate the starting point of education, and then moving further down the line, if you are successful in understanding a drug well enough on a risk benefit profile to facilitate pre-license access, and then post commercialization, if successful, ongoing and continued access. GARD Access that also has to help industry think about, how do you think about that longer term? And so again, it's that dialogue, and it starts with the basics of education and then moving through. And I think that from all of our experience, GARD Access will also learn from the different size and types of industry partners, depending where they're based, depending their level of experience or exposure to rare. There are a lot of factors that go in as to the range of what a manufacturer may expect, what they may need, what they may be able to partner with in 2022 versus 2032. So it's a dialogue, but it needs to be frequent and very frank, and having open discussions with the patient organizations involved.
Thanks, Sarah. We have another question from Patty Tracy that says, given the uniqueness of different countries, do you have an idea of which countries or diseases should be piloted proof of concept in phase 2?
I think, Darhan, you might have some ideas around, I know we've had that conversation.
Hopefully there will be huge demand, and hopefully there will be a huge willingness on the part of farmers, Sarah, so that, what we're going to be looking for is how to get the best match, right? I am hoping that, based on the framework that has been developed, which I think is going to be very powerful, we will end up with having a series of criteria. We've got 6 stakeholder groups at least, right? What do we need to see from each one of these, including governments, as an indication of willingness, or at least that there's a pathway there in order for us to be able to make this happen. And I don't want to be accused of just going for low-hanging fruit, but I do think that we want to pick off those projects that are going to have the highest likelihood of success, as well as, having some significant impact. So I don't think it's a specific country as much as looking at the range of stakeholders and really being able to hone in. So as Harpreet says, maybe it's going to be in India. Of course, it's not going to be across India. I look at, we have a meeting coming up with the Asia Pacific Alliance coming up. We've got Malaysia there, we've got Philippines there, we'll have Thailand there, we'll have Indonesia there, and I would say that in any one of those countries, right, you've got some real pockets that are going to be interested in terms of being able to do this. So I am hoping that, we'll be able to do something that will be a sort of I don't know if it's a call for proposals or a call for, submissions. It may be something quite that crass, or it may be, each of us kind of having those deliberate conversations, as Harpreet says, and getting that proof of concept that will allow us to be able to move forward. I think the challenges will be, how do we make sure that it's seen as fair? How do we make sure that it is seen as being, I won't say unbiased, because there will be some picking and choosing, but that we are going, to be looking at equity. I wish it were as simple as saying, well, we'll go to where the greatest need is. I don't think that's going to be absolutely the driver. I think it's going to be, for me, going to where there's the greatest likelihood that we will be able to get some success. And I really wouldn't even mind, if some of those proof of concepts were actually in better resource countries, but also have huge pockets of inequity, because I think that is as serious, as anything else. But to me, one of the biggest things is, how do we build a community? Is there a willingness there?
I agree with that. I think that would be something I would focus in on is there willingness to partner?
Mhm. I think, Harpreet, I think, and Duran, I wholeheartedly agree. I think I could frame for you today where UCB, if I put my UCB only hat on instead of Sarah working in rare, talk about where we're looking at initiatives. But what's important is, how do we measure that impact that we're having, not on just an individual patient basis, but the impact to society. So I also think that the opportunity is now with lots of businesses and for-profit organizations looking at social business impact and how to partner that with the connectivity to the resolution, to the interest in providing access for healthcare for all. And I know that we're close on time, and I'm happy to talk a little bit more about my experience in this, as well as the GARD access. I know, Duran, you and I are going to see each other at World Orphan Drug next week in Barcelona. So if anybody that's on the line wants to connect while we're there, I just want to make sure I pop that in, because of course I'm going to run to my last meeting of the day here in Brussels. But as we wrap this call up, but I just want to put it out there because I think let's start the dialogue and think about what could be possible.
Absolutely. Yep.
We have about 3 minutes left, and I have about 5 questions. I'm just going to drop so you can pick and choose and see if you can cover them all in a rapid fashion. So Rachel Yang has said, to follow up on what Sarah said, to work with the Ministry of Health is an important success factor. Any suggestions on how to do that based on your experience? Mary Wayne said, in your stepwise approach, what do you foresee is the most difficult stage? Is it the proof of concept or further down the line? We also have a question about how to engage. How do we engage in this? How do we, for those that have joined that are very interested in this initiative, how do we reach out? And then there's another question about the guidelines and how we'll be able to access the guidelines once they are available.
So I can quickly try to touch on some of these. The ministries of health, in the past, we've actually partnered with local patient advocacy organizations, as well as local physicians who then approach, the local ministers that they can connect with. So that's usually the route to take. I know in my experience in the past, there was actually a proactive request from a Ministry of Health to invite the company to have a conversation before they rolled out a charitable access program, and the company decided not to actually go to that conversation because they felt like they were going to try to build they were going to end up building too many expectations, but that's really not the case. So I think the best for me, global patient advocacy organizations can then connect you with local advocacy organizations, and that's probably the best starting point. In terms of most difficult phase, I from my experience, and Sarah and Duran, you can chime in, I think the proof of concept is probably going to be the most difficult stage, because it's the fear of the unknown, right? We don't know whether or not this is going to be as successful as we hope for it to be. So I think it's going to be the fear of unknown that's going to stop from people to volunteer, to participate, or be the first guinea pigs, if you will. So I think that's sort of my thoughts on that. And how do we engage? I think our PQMD colleagues are putting our email addresses in the chat. You're welcome to reach out to me, Durhan or Sarah. We're happy to get back to you and connect with the right people.
All right, great. Thanks, Harpreet. I think we're up on time here, and I think we'll go ahead and wrap things up if that's all right with everyone. Just first of all, wanted to thank Harpreet, Durhan, Sarah. Great to have all three of you involved. And, you know, it's really encouraging to me, and I'm sure to others, to have people with your experience at the center of trying to address the access challenges in the rare disease community. And I think, you know, it's easy to be into looking at things from a short-term perspective, but I'm confident we get 5 years down the road and we look back 5 years, we'll realize how much we've accomplished. And, you know, it's really encouraging to me to see that there are a lot of really smart, knowledgeable people gathered around this important topic. So really engaging webinar. Thank everyone for their participation and attendance, and look forward to the next conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.